Hello, I'm Mike Slicker and this is Pinellas Pass. The boot on your screens a minute ago has been a landmark here in Pinellas County for years and years. I know that when I'm in the car with my kids going up to Booker Creek Park to have a picnic, when we go by County Road 584 and McMullen Booth Road, the kids hang out the window and look and giggle and wonder who's the big fellow who lost his boot out there. And I talked with a girl the other evening who goes to school over at University of South Florida, and she mentioned the fact that she never would have found the university over there winding through the back roads of Pinellas if it hadn't have been for the boot alongside of the road out there. The interesting fact to me, the especially interesting thing, is that that particular boot, as well known as it is to us here in Pinellas County, is probably equally well known elsewhere around the world. And as a matter of fact, with a strange twist, that same boot is responsible for the University of South Florida being the Golden Brahmins. For about a quarter of the century, the ranch out there supplied much of the world's Brahmin cattle, the stock-bred cattle. And the man that we have with us today, Mr. A.D. Boyd, is indeed the man who wears those boots. He's the owner-operator of Boot Ranch. We'll be here with Mr. Boyd the rest of the show, but first of all, we're going to hear from our pioneer editor, Charlie Jones.
Thank you, Mike, and hello all in TV land. We are glad to bring to you history in the news. This is a time of year when elections are in the forefront of our minds. Present-day politicians are working hard to obtain votes leading to their election. In choosing our elected officials, we often think of the many bills offered to the legislative process, such as tax reform in Tallahassee and in Washington. Let us look at some of the political news from 70 years ago in 1916. Headlines state that Congress wants to clean the slate for campaign. To accomplish this, United States Democrats and Republicans were to have a joint conference to expedite the important legislature so Congress could adjourn for the political campaign. The Democrat Steering Committee had decided on a program which would hold the Senate in session 9 hours daily until it completed the Army and Navy Appropriations Bill, the Revenue and Shipping Bill, Child Labor and Corrupt Practice Measures, listed as imperative legislation. The general sentiment of the Republicans seemed to be against a filibuster on the revenue and shipping bills, and the days continued to pass. A compromise sorts did occur. Although a further conference between the House and Senate was necessary to present a final approval, and general figures of military preparedness were, and I'll give you these figures: Army, 314 million, Navy, 315 million, fortifications, 25 million, military academy, 2 million. The Senate exceeded the House version by 131 million. This excess was in part caused by a $2 million appropriation for the relief of families of the guardsmen and regulars in the Mexican emergency. No family was to get more than $50 a month, however. In another area, the U.S. Advocate General ruled that the state soldiers were not subject to duty outside the United States unless and until they were drafted by order of the President. He also ruled that they were under the control of the federal government and not the respective state governments, and that they were entitled to the same pensions and privileges as the regulars. And that's the way it was with part of the political news 70 years ago. And back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much indeed. We're back here with Mr. Alfred Boyd, the owner and operator of the Boot Ranch. And Mr. Boyd himself has made a study of the cattle ranching industry here in Florida. And let's back up for a moment, Mr. Boyd, and can you tell us how cattle ranching actually got started here in Pinellas County?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll try to make it short as possible. When Florida was admitted as a state, after being a territory, about the only industry in Florida was the poor farmers, some timber operations, and communications were very, very poor. The only improvements and modernization at all came along the seacoast. Mm-hmm. Back from the seacoast, the farmers, not having supplies, had to grow their own garden vegetables. They had to produce their own meat. So most every farmer had a small herd of cattle, not only for meat, but he would pen them at night to collect the fertilizer for his garden, because commercial fertilizer was not available. Communications did not improve for many years, but the herds of cattle improved and grew. And as they grew, it took more care for the animals. The people that are producing these cattle learned to control them with cow whips. Mm-hmm. And that is the place that Florida Cracker got his name. Mm-hmm. And I think that perhaps your viewers would like to see an authentic cow whip. That is 16 feet in length. It's braided one whip across the other until they get the size and the taper that they want. Mm-hmm. This cracker is made of Indian tan buckskin, and it is possible to make these out of horse's tail hair or many other modern fabrics. Mm-hmm. But the cracker here is where the Florida Cracker received his title, the Florida mm-hmm. Cracker.
And you've obviously used this. What sort of things can you do with it? I mean, or could a cracker do with it?
Well, for instance, when I was about through work and on the way home on County Road 77, known as the East Lake Road, right there at Brooker Creek Bridge, I'd pull the whip down and I'd pop it one time. Now, I say pop the whip because of people from the north called it cracking a whip, but the Florida Cracker spoke of it as popping a whip. I would pop this whip at the Brooker Creek Bridge, and my mother over on the Curlew Road at our old home place would start supper. Mm-hmm. When I'd get there, my dinner was ready.
Mm-hmm. You could hear it that far away then.
I have positive proof that this whip has been heard for 7 miles.
My goodness. But
now that goes back to the early Florida history. Up until recent years, we had a great deal of pine timber in this area. Pinellas County received its name because of the pine timber here. Mm-hmm. Now, with the pine timber, this will make a far greater noise than any shotgun. And with the pine timber, it reverberates from one tree to the next for miles and miles. Mm-hmm. Besides being a signaling device, when you're out on the open range like we used to have, you had to supply your own meat. Well, riding along, you see a squirrel or rabbit along about lunchtime or evening, pull down on this whip, cut his head off, and you were ready for another meal. Now that is just an idea of what it can be used for.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me, is it easier to use in the pinelands too? Is it easier than a lariat, for instance?
Well, you wouldn't replace a lariat with it at all. Mm-hmm. A lariat serves a purpose for catching the cattle. Now, in Argentina, they have a device with two little balls on the end of a rope they throw and wrap around the legs of the animal and throw them. But we do not practice that in this country. Now, this also is used for an unruly animal. If the bull is unruly, you can usually conquer him very easily with a whip.
Well, back in coming forward, I guess, a little bit then, when you got involved in the cattle industry, I guess it was actually your father before you who had begun to raise the cattle and that sort of thing, Mr. Jesse Boyd. And along about what time did he begin to assemble a herd? Or is that the right thing to say in Pinellas?
Yes. My dad, Jesse Boyd, came here in '84, I believe, and he had schooling up until college age at Sylvan Abbey Log School. When he started in Southern College, located in Sutherland, Florida, which is now Palm Harbor, he opened a meat market and a delivery service for the outlying areas, because a lot of the people moving to the edges of the town did not have refrigeration and their meat supply was nil. So he would peddle meat in a buggy drawn by 2 horses. He managed the market and peddled meat, and also made enough of that to pay 2 sisters' way through school at the same time he was in college. And I don't know just the exact date of Southern Seminary burning, but I can remember it distinctly. I think it was about 1918. It was a tremendous wooden building and made a flame that you could see for miles and miles. It was made of the heart of the southern longleaf pine, and it made a wonderful fire.
So that's about the time that he began to assemble the herd and began to acquire some of the land on which to put them, right?
He did not acquire land to speak of at that time, except for a small citrus grove or 2. He did start buying cattle and slaughtering himself, then cutting up the quarters into usable cuts for the consumer. And he continued in that business up until, I would say, in the early 40s. He had a slaughterhouse on the Curlew Road, and as he would slaughter cattle, he would buy entire herds all over the state, ship in here, or drive into Pinellas County. We had an unloading pen at Palm Harbor area, right at the town of Ozona. And they were there until 5 or 6 years ago, and they were finally wrecked. And he continued to increase the size of his herd, but we had no land at that time. He and the other cattlemen, increasing their herds of cattle, used the open, free range. All the towns were fenced to keep the livestock out. When you went to town, you had to get out of the gate, get out of the buggy and open the gate to drive in. Likewise when you're leaving. And inside the towns, each home was fenced. When Dunedin was incorporated about 1888, somewhere in that neighborhood, the first ordinance that was passed by the town council was to confine the hogs to keep them from roaming the streets of Dunedin.
My goodness. We need to take a break right here, Mr. Boyd, and we'll be back in a moment to learn a little bit about the cattle industry after the fencing laws took effect. We'll be right back.
The Pinellas County Historical Society wishes to invite you to attend the 9th Annual Country Jubilee on Saturday, October 25th from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. on the grounds of Heritage Park. Being one of the largest arts and crafts festivals in the Tampa Bay area, it features 125 craftspersons and 6 well-known antique dealers with articles for sale. Continuous entertainment from the bandstand will offer bluegrass music, cloggers, square dancers, and special entertainment for children. Children will also enjoy clown face painting and the petting zoo. Food and drinks will be sold on the grounds. The park's 14 historical buildings will be open to visitors with demonstrations of turn-of-the-century skills being performed throughout the day. Admission is absolutely free, however, donations are appreciated. All proceeds from the Country Jubilee are used to benefit Heritage Park, which is located at 11909 125th Street North in Largo. Hope to see you there.
Hello, we're back again with Mr. Boyd, and I'm holding in my hands here the original Boot Ranch brand. Mr. Boyd, can you tell me how the brand came to be and how the ranch came to have the name in the first place?
Well, to begin with, this brand was used for many years before the Boot Ranch was named that. My dad had purchased a herd of cattle about the north end of Lake Tarpon. This old German owner had used this outline of a foot for a brand, but everyone called it a boot. My dad used that for years. When my dad passed away in June of 1950, I took over the brand from with the consent of the other heirs, and about that time we established what is known as the Boot Ranch by name. Mm-hmm. We had had the property for some time, but had never called it a ranch. And in acquiring this property, my dad had started me off when I was about 6 years old, well, about 10 years old, helping him a little bit, marking and branding the calves. He'd give me a heifer calf each year. Mm-hmm. By the time I was of age, I had a nice herd of my own cattle. Mm-hmm. And one day we were talking, and he said, "Son, if we stay in the cattle business, we're going to have to own our lands." Mm-hmm. So I agreed with him. And just about that time, an attorney in St. Petersburg offered us 5,000 acres of land in Pasco County for $3 an acre.
My goodness.
So we went to the bank. After talking with this man, we agreed to purchase it. We went to the bank and offered our security. First National Bank of Dunedin at that time was one of the oldest banks in the area. They said, "Your security is perfect." I offered to mortgage my cattle, what little land I had and all. They said, "Your security is perfect, but the Bank of Dunedin doesn't have $15,000.
Oh my God.
That was the early
year?
30s.
Early 30s, yes.
Right in the height of the Depression.
That's right.
So they agreed to let us have half the money, and the president of the bank went with us to the Exchange National Bank in Tampa to get $7,500. That was our first purchase of land. Mm-hmm. The next purchase of land came succeeding years until 1942. The St. George Fechtig estate became available. A packing company in Dade City purchased the groves, and we purchased the wildlands where our cattle had been grazing for many years as a free range. At my dad's death, the same month, June of 1950, the state passed a no-fence law. You could not let your cattle roam at large. So my dad and I were just ahead of the state a little bit. So we were prepared to an extent, but I had to build that year 21 miles of fence to keep our cattle on the lands that we controlled. And in doing that, we were acquiring more land all the time. And about 39, the Army called me. I went into the service, volunteered first to leave Pinellas County. I soon got into manufacturing leather goods in the service. And the money I would send home, my attorney in Clearwater had authority to write checks on my account for any land available in northeast Pinellas County, known as East Lake area now. And we built up the ranch. As my dad was purchasing the Fechtig estate, I was purchasing on my own the Scott estate, which encompassed land in north of Oldsmar and a portion of Oldsmar. And we built it up until we had a pretty solid holding. And that we didn't own, we leased or looked after the property for the use of it. So it made us a usable ranch. And after my dad passed away, while he was on his deathbed, he said, "Son, I'm going to have a sign painted on this new truck I've ordered, a large cattle truck, the Big Boot Ranch." So he didn't get to enjoy the truck. He passed away, and I purchased the truck for the estate and was using it. We had a field of 300 acres in northeast Pinellas County in watermelon. Tremendous field. Oh, I had to use the truck for that, and we need a little advertising on it, so I hired this sign painter to paint the Boot Ranch on there. Now, bear in mind it had never been known as a boot ranch before. That in the painting of that sign, I asked this sign painter to design an entranceway sign for the ranch. He came up with a pencil sketch of this boot sitting on a mound of dirt. I bought it immediately. Asked him to build a boot. He said, "Well, I can't build it except in fiberglass." I said, "Well, I like it in cement." He said, "I can't do cement work." So I agreed with him. He made the boot in fiberglass. It lasted about 2 years and went bad. So I took the remains of that, my own boots, and all the pictures I could find to a welding shop in Dunedin. We made the framework of the boot, set it on a pedestal, then I had a concrete mason to come and plaster that 3 inches thick on all the galvanized metal. And today it doesn't even have a pin crack in it. It needs painting badly. And as I understand it, they hope to keep that as a symbol for a shopping center.
Oh, my goodness. But going back for a minute to the ranch, obviously you and your father were had well anticipated the fencing laws and all of that sort of thing. You anticipated something else too, and in fact brought the Brahman cattle to this area in a very early time and continued to develop the breed. First of all, when was it that you actually brought the Brahman cattle onto the ranch?
We would purchase bulls of the Brahman breed all through the 30s. And the main qualities that we found in the Brahman breed.
That was my next question. Good.
I anticipated that. Chickens, grain, anything that you can name today, it is a hybrid. Well, now the cross of a Brahman bull with the female of the European varieties, such as a Hereford, the Angus, the Charolais, and those, when you cross, you get a true hybrid. And the offspring of that hybrid is better than either parent, giving you an average of 100-pound gain in an 8-month-old weaning calf. 100 pounds of good red edible meat. Plus the fact that the hybridization of the cattle maintained the ability to be resistant to insects and heat. You never see a Brahman animal go to a shade. They lie right down in the hottest sun. They're highly resistant to ticks and flies, not immune, but highly resistant. The Brahman is the only cattle in the world that can sweat. You run a Brahman and he will sweat like a horse. That sweat is an oily secretion that tends to reject the insects.
Okay. And how is it different to raise Brahman cattle than any of the other cattle breeds? Are there particular and peculiar differences?
They can make the living where other cattle starve to death. They can eat oak leaves or pine bark and thrive on it.
Yes.
But now,
And you were, well, at one time you were president of the Southeastern Brahman Cattle's Association as well.
yes, sir.
And at that time you had a lot to do with the exporting of the cattle here from Florida. And you were also involved in something called the Florida International, you're going to have to help me.
The Trade Council.
Trade Council, yes, exactly. And that too grew up here in Pinellas County.
Well, now, that Trade Council was not my idea. That was Clyde J. Keyes, the clerk of the Circuit Court of Pinellas County at one time. And he, at that time, was president of the Brahman Breeders Association of the Southeast. Mr. Keyes passed away, and I succeeded him as president of the Southeastern Brahman Breeders Association. And I continued to push his ideas of a trade organization to push the export of Brahman cattle. We were not too successful in getting help there, so we enlisted aid of all producers of farm product and equipment. And finally, an organization was formed, and I refused to take any part in it, but I instigated the idea only.
And
to promote
that was
the breed.
an idea to bring international trade here
Right.
to Florida.
Now, Doyle Connor, our Commissioner of Agriculture at the time,
And the, you were talking about Mr. Doyle Connor, who went ahead and did all of that. I wanted to talk a little bit more personally for a minute and talk a little bit about your leather work in the few remaining moments.
All right.
One of the things that a lot of the people may not realize is that all of the Western gear and tack that was part of the boot ranch was manufactured there on the ranch. And indeed, you yourself are quite a leather artisan. And this is a bag that you did at one point, and this is a wide belt, and this is an interesting little thing here. In just the few remaining seconds that we have, what can you tell us a little bit? There's an interesting story that goes with
this is an alligator work. The alligator was killed in Lake Tarpon. I made a Western saddle, an English saddle, and all the equipment to go with it of alligator hide. It was killed in Lake Tarpon. It took several hides to make it all up, but this is one of the smaller hides. And it was tanned at Tarpon Springs. We had one of the world's finest tanneries in Tarpon Springs. And they tan for many of the big manufacturers of shoes, for instance. And this is part of their work. And I manufactured this in 1939, and it's been around my shop ever since.
And these are actually done with, this is carved leather, you said?
That is carved leather, and it is actually designed, is actually cut into the leather and then shaded and trimmed up a little bit, but that's a solid piece of leather, and that's what they call a kidney belt for truck drivers and heavy equipment operators. And we made luggage. Could you take that out and show?
I wish we could. We really don't have any time.
Hi, and welcome to Pinellas Past. In this program, we will be going back in time almost as far as we can with a personal history of the northern area of Pinellas County. Our guest, Sarah Meyer Gallagher, is a true native of this area, and I'm sure she has more to tell us than we could ever really discover in 30 minutes, but we're going to do the very best we can. But before we get into that exciting history, we'll begin our historical adventure tonight with our history news from our pioneer editor, Charlie Jones.
Thank you, Winona, and hello to everyone watching this program. We are glad to bring you history and the news. On our last program, we talked about Wall Springs, Florida in the 20s and in the 1930s. And now, let us tell you about another place that was about 2.5 miles almost due east of Wall Springs in Palm Harbor, Florida. This place was called Cobb Acres in the 1920s and 30s. This place was owned by the Cobb family, which was a very prominent road building family in the state of Florida. Cobb Acres was located on the west side of Lake Butler, and this lake was known for its good speckled perch and bass fishing. And the lake name has been changed to Lake Tarpon, but to the old timers, it will always be Lake Butler. Cobb Acres consisted of several hundred acres of beautiful orange and grapefruit groves, and also had a beautiful wooded areas on the shoreline of Lake Butler. Mr. Cobb and his family could see the need for a park and that the public could use free of charge as a recreation area. The park consisted of picnic shelters, cooking facilities, bathrooms, boats, a playground, a boat launching facility, and many other good things such as a swimming areas, snack bars, and last but not least, a very good dock or pier. The dock was surely known for its romantic atmosphere, as the moon seemed to rise on the east side of Lake Butler and set on Cobb's Acres on the west side of the lake. The boys and their dates usually went to this place after church on Sunday night. The park was used by many different organizations such as churches, Boy and Girl Scouts, and all kinds of civic groups and others. And to many of us crackers who enjoyed many good times at Cobb Acres, we are thankful for the Cobb family that provided the community with this facility for the people in the 20s and 30s. And that's the way it was at Cobb Acres. And now, back to you, Winona.
Thank you so much. And now we'll get right on to the history of Tarpon Springs and the entire northern part of Pinellas County, long before either of those names had even been considered or thought of. One of the very first settlers in this area was Benjamin Franklin Meyer, and our guest tonight, Sarah Meyer Gallagher, was his granddaughter. And we do appreciate you being with us, Sarah, and we know that we're going to learn a lot about the early history of the county with all the things that you have to tell us. So first, could you just really take the family back before they even came to the United States? We talked today that everybody's come to Florida from somewhere else. Where did the Meyer family originally come from, and where did they settle when they first came to this country?
Well, thank you so much, Winona. Actually, the Meyer men, and I assume one wife anyway, came from Germany. Unfortunately, I do not know from what part of Germany, but I have always been told that they came to escape military conscription in Germany. And they eventually, in this country, they got to South Carolina. And there, my grandfather, Benjamin Franklin Meyer, married my grandmother, whose family was already settled there. They were English. They were settled in the area near Abbeville, in South Carolina and near Columbia. And her name was Sarah Ann Goen. They were married there and then came on down to Ocala.
That's up in Marion County.
Yes, up in Marion County. And he settled there and started a plantation where he grew tobacco and cotton and also had an orange grove. His brother, Frederick, apparently came at about that same time. He too settled in the same area and on a plantation. And coincidentally, his wife was named Sarah. And they farmed and raised their family there. They both had slaves, and until the Civil War. And about that time, as the war progressed, they freed their people and gave them a parcel of land and the cabins in which they lived. My grandfather was a sergeant in the Confederate Army, and he is buried in Anclote, and we have his military marker on his grave there in Anclote.
But he actually served
But he
in the
actually
war.
served in that war. As a youth, he served in the Mexican War. And I'll talk about that at some later time. But when he came back from the war, he found, of course, as every other person did, the same way, things were in a pretty bad way. And so in 1867, both the brothers and their families gathered their household goods together, and they came down to the Anclote River. They were coming to salt water. Malaria was so bad up and around those parts in Ocala, and they had both lost children from malaria fever, and that time they didn't know what caused malaria fever. So they thought if they could get to the salt water, that would really be a good thing.
So that was the only reason
That
they
was the
actually
main
came back
reason that they came down, was
to
to get
this
to the
area.
salt water, and also because of the land was good. It was lush river, lush land. It was all jungle then. And when they got here, Frederick chose to go to the little settlement of Anclote, and he settled in that area, right in what is now the village of Anclote. But my father, my grandfather, Benjamin Franklin, came to the mouth of the Anclote River and settled on the north bank of the river near the point. They both brought, they came down in covered wagons. They brought their families, and they had a covered wagon drawn by an ox team. They had another wagon drawn by mules, and they had a horse and buggy. And I'll have to speak now more about Benjamin Franklin because I know a bit more about him. But they drove a herd of 40 cattle down, and I'm sure they brought pigs and chickens along with them, and I'm sure some of their people came along with them too, as did Frederick. Some of Frederick's families came with them.
Do you know how many people actually came. Total with both families?
With both families. Well, you mean the black people, how many came?
And the
I don't know that. I do know that that with Benjamin Franklin had 6 children.
At that
Had
time?
5 children at that time. My father was not born. They left the eldest son. I don't dare to say. You want to say this later, don't you? They left their eldest son was left in Ocala on the plantation to manage what was left of the plantation and try to do as much with it as he could. So they came down, and the nearest place, their trip down was very interesting, but I won't have time to go into that now. But the nearest place where they could get supplies was Cedar Key.
Oh.
And Grandfather had a sailboat. and he and his brother Frederick would go in the sailboat to Cedar Key for supplies. And on one of the trips that they went to Cedar Key, they were having a yellow fever epidemic, and my father came home, and 2 weeks later, my grandfather came home, and 2 weeks later he died.
With yellow fever?
With yellow fever. And about a year later, his brother, Uncle Frederick, went on a trip up, and the same experience happened, and he came home and died.
Oh my goodness.
And so they left their wives with small children in this uninhabited, well, practically uninhabited jungle.
How many other families were there in the area at that time? Do
That
you know?
I don't know. There were not, I really don't know. There were not too many. There were some. Of course, there was no such thing as Tarpon Springs or even a village of Tarpon Springs. And but there was a settlement there at Anclote, and I do know that Captain Sam Hope was one of the first settlers there at Anclote. And I've kind of lost myself now. But
he was no kin to the Meyer family.
No
so
kin at all to the Meyer family. There was no relation whatsoever.
I have a copy that you showed me of the deed. I don't know that this is going to pick up at all on the camera, but I think it's interesting that at that time, of course, we were Hillsborough County, and this is given to the Meyer family by the Florida Internal Improvement Fund.
Yeah.
But
He purchased it.
that's just a copy. And what did you say that
He
you believe
purchased
they paid for the land at that time?
120 acres for 75 cents an acre. on the river.
75 cents.
How I wish we had it now.
And how much did they purchase?
120 acres.
Oh my goodness. And that was right on the point.
Right on the point. And down, well, on down, traveling what direction? East. East.
That's fantastic.
But when they came down, they quickly built a log cabin.
Now this was, of course, before your grandfather died.
Yes, yes. He died. They came in 1867, and he died in 1871. So they didn't have very long, and that's why I'm positive that he had help.
So you believe
I
that
know,
some
because
of the
in that
black people
yes,
that they had freed
yes,
at that time
yes, chose
came
to come
with them?
because he cleared the land, put up a log cabin, and he planted a grove. Now that wasn't many years for them to get all that done in
That's
that
right.
time.
He would have been here in 4 years.
Yes,
At the time of his
that's
death.
right. And he begged my grandmother not to sell any of the land, but circumstances altered cases, and in later years she was, I guess, more or less forced to sell land, practically at a very bad bargain, I think, for a team of mules. She sold a lot of her land.
Well,
But-
Sarah, we will get back to that in just a few minutes. I believe we have to take a break right now. So we'll do that, and then we'll come back and find out just how they did make a living after all those hardships. And we want to hear a little bit more about your father. So now we'll take a short break.
Okay.
Welcome to Heritage Park. I'm Sandy Tidsworth. I teach 3rd grade in the Pinellas County School System at Walsingham Elementary. Heritage Park is a 21-acre historical park featuring homes and lifestyles from the turn of the century. Heritage Park has various educational programs to offer the schools, one of which is their traveling exhibits. One exhibit consists of photographs from themes such as making a living and transportation at the turn of the century. Another exhibit consists of small-sized boxes with articles from the turn of the century which children can examine from themes such as a school life and the country store. For more information, contact the Education Coordinator at 462-3474.
Now we're going to return to all this interesting history of the family, but not only the family, but this whole area. Sarah Gallagher is our guest, and we've talked about your grandparents and the hardships that they had coming down. What about your father? Was he one of those children? I believe you said he was not born when they actually came to the area.
My father was born in 1869, and he was the youngest of what was 7 children then. He was the 7th child. Can I just say this right quickly in passing, that Frederick in Anclote had 4 children, I believe, and Cousin Greenmeyer, one of his sons, had a store in Anclote and the post office. Now, of course, this was years, you know, as he grew to manhood, and that's what he did. And he gave, eventually, he gave what is now the Anclote Cemetery to the community. And he had, I said he had a post office, didn't I?
Yes.
And I think this is interesting. His home was purchased by the Vinson family. And Jean and Barbara Vinson live there now on the river. And the mail slot where the mail was put in is still in the wall in the side of their house, and they take very good care to keep it there.
Oh,
so
my
I think
goodness.
that's interesting. And he had a store which was partially in Hillsborough and partially in Pinellas at that time. And now he is the descendant from Frederick, now living here in Tarpon Springs, is Hazel Anderson.
Okay.
And she is another...
So she would be your first cousin?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And she's another one. Well, getting back
Well,
to...
we have a lot of relatives
Yes,
in
we
the area.
do.
don't
We certainly do. A lot of kissing cousins.
All right, when was your father born?
In
You said 1869.
Yes, he was. And grandmother started the first school in the area in her home, and she taught all the children, black or white, in the area who could come to her for learning.
Well, since
That
we're
was
celebrating the 75th anniversary of our school system this year, that's interesting.
Well, I
and the
think-
fact that it wasn't a school system at that time.
No, there certainly wasn't.
But at least she saw the need for education even at that time.
She had taught the children on the plantation, too. And she had graduated from a conservatory of music in South Carolina. And I'm sure that she must have had her piano, but I don't know whatever happened to that. Of course, in this country, many things go. I'm sure if it was possible for them to bring it, it may not have even been possible for them to bring it down. I don't know.
Could we get back just a moment to how she and, at that time,
Survived.
6 children, because they left the oldest one up in Marion
Right.
County, so she had 6 here. How did they survive after the death of
Her
the husband and father?
Right. I have wondered myself. They were a hardy breed. I'm telling you, she was a wonderful woman. The only cash money that she had was a very small pension from the government,
Yes, go ahead.
from the Mexican War, right? And but she had well, they boiled mullet heads and skimmed off the oil to get oil for cooking and possibly even to burn for lights at night, like if they burned whale oil. They could have done that too. But she had a garden, and of course eventually the grove, and chickens and pigs and fish, plenty of fish, and there was plenty of wildlife for the older ones to hunt and to help to supply the table. And then the Cuban fishermen would come in and anchor their smacks, their Cuban smacks, out on the 3-mile limit.
Now this is what they call their boats.
Yes,
with the
they're
smacks.
fishing smacks. And they anchored them out on the 3-mile limit, and then in small boats they would come up the river. And she would trade them fresh water, chickens, eggs, vegetables, and later when she had fruit, whatever she had that she could trade them, they would bring her coffee, sugar, molasses, rum, salt, what the supplies that she needed. Because I don't remember after Grandfather and Uncle Fred both died, I don't know whether anyone went up to Cedar Key to get supplies.
I was going to ask who could have
Yes,
gone.
I don't know how that worked out.
So they had to depend on these boats
and on
coming in to help
themselves.
them.
I do remember
Well,
that.
They did have quite a time.
They had brought. Now I'm not sure. I know lumber had been brought. Some probably from Ocala, and then possibly, since Cedar Key was a source, you know, big sawmills up there, that Grandfather had probably gotten lumber from up there too, but they never got the house built. And she sold a lot of that lumber for coffins. And they drove the cattle across the river to what they called Deserters Hill. And it was they were promptly stolen by rustlers.
Oh dear.
So that didn't help the situation any. But eventually the family survived and grew to womanhood and manhood. And I don't know what you want me to say now.
What about your father now? As he was growing up, what did he eventually do?
My father eventually married Alice Brown from Elfers, and they had 6 children themselves. And he and his brother Gus, in the early 1900s, or very late 18-something, I'm not just sure of the date, started the Meyer Brothers Sponge Ranch at Bailey's Bluff. There were no Greek divers here then, and the spongers came from the Keys, the Bahamas, and they were hookers.
Sponge hookers.
Sponge hookers, we should say. And they used glass bottom buckets, you know, and hooked up the sponge out of the shallow waters with these long poles. And Daddy had the sponge crawls, Daddy and Uncle Gus, they were in it together, had the sponge crawls and long dock, and sometime when Charlie and Winona want it, they can have pictures, if you would like, at some future date, of the sponge ranch down there. That Bailey's Bluff was at that time called Security. They had a post
I've heard
office.
of that name, yes.
They had a post office. Daddy was postmaster. He was officially appointed postmaster, as was Cousin Green at Anclote. Daddy was at Security, and I think we have his licenses and registrations for several years, 3 I'm sure of, that he was postmaster there. And there was a telephone because Blaine LaCourse's mother was only 15, and she was a telephone operator, and she remembers calling down to
Security.
Security. Yes, she does. And some very wealthy woman came down there, and she built a huge open-air church. And I don't know, Charlie, do you remember? I'm not supposed to ask you.
That's all right.
Does Charlie remember that open-air church, or do you by any chance remember it?
No.
Well, it was an Episcopal church. And because when I was growing up, there was nothing left but the floor and the roof. And in the back, the sacristy and the another 2 or 3 small rooms in the back of the church. But I have heard my parents and other old-timers here describe how all those black, you know, most of the Bahamians were Episcopalians, Church of England, and the Key West people too, and how on Sundays it was just marvelous to hear them singing there in the church. Now that was an interesting thing there, and eventually, of course, there's nothing of it left, you know.
But this was all at Bailey's
yes,
Bluff.
That was all at Bailey's Bluff.
Or Security, as it was known in those days.
Security. Then, along about 1910, in the meantime, Tarpon had come into existence, and Mr. Cheney, a man from the north, came here, and he was instrumental in bringing the Greeks, divers from Greece. And of course, then they could go out deeper, and that really put the hookers pretty much out of business.
So the hookers worked close.
Oh yes, they had to work in shallow water.
I don't think I've realized that the sponges used to be that near.
Yes, Well, they're enough that they could hook them with a real, maybe not over 20 feet or something, because they didn't dive for them. Then the Greek divers, you know.
But the Greek divers, of course,
go
could go
down
deeper and go
deeper.
down. How did that bring about the Ankle Oak Lighthouse that I think the family was connected with also?
Well, I don't know. I suppose the government, after there became, after it got to be more shipping up here, more boats, fishing boats, and as the years went on, by that time, I know when my father was 16, and Uncle Bob, his brother, was about 18. It was about 2 years between. They both worked out at the lighthouse, helping to build it. And then Uncle Bob became tender for the lighthouse and tended the light for 40 years. He started tending the light in a sailboat in all kinds of weather. And when it was just a kerosene lamp, and he'd have to go up and polish those lenses. And he had, his family lived out on the island with him.
Oh, so they actually lived
They
on
actually
Ankle Oak
lived on
Key.
Ankle Oak Key. And he lived out there, I guess, off and on, I guess, until he retired. I can't tell you exactly the date which he retired, but it was, in the last, I say 1940s, sometime in the 1940s probably, or early 50s that he
Actually,
retired.
rather recent.
Rather
His-
recently.
Goodness, and now we're still trying to preserve the lighthouse.
we're trying-
Just very quickly, I think your father had something to do with discovering the connection between
Oh.
Lake Butler, or Lake Tarpon as we
Well-
know it today, and the bayou.
At about 1913, he purchased a block of land on what was Lake Butler then, and built us a home out there. And we moved out in around the latter part of 1913, 1914. There were no families on that side of the lake in that area, except Daddy's land adjoined the Duke of Sutherland's land. And of course, everyone knows about the Duke of Sutherland and that story. And his mansion was still there, a beautiful old country, English country type, 3-story house. And, but Daddy always suspected that there was some connection between the bayou and the lake, because the lake would get very high, and then all at once it would start going down, and it would recede until there were just much there. So he sunk bags of sawdust at where he thought the underground passage was, and it boiled up in Spring Bayou, and that is where they built the cofferdam today.
Right, and so that was there.
Right.
Well, they have had a lot to do with this
Yes.
whole area
Yes,
then,
they
haven't
have.
they? Well, Sarah, I think we're going to have to wrap up the program for tonight, and we do appreciate you being with us so much and sharing all of these kind memories with us. And just for the benefit of our crew and as well as the listening audience, I think they might like to know that Sarah's grandfather, Benjamin Franklin Meyer, is the great-grandfather of our pioneer editor, Mr. Charlie Jones. So we're all related, and we do appreciate you again being here and sharing with us. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a lot of fun.
And thank you, Winona. It's been a great pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed it too.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm B.J. Maloney with the Palm Harbor Historical Society, and that's easier than it looks easier than it is. We want to welcome you tonight and join us in our study of the history of the Palm Harbor Post Office. And we want to also say that this show is put on in coordination with the Pinellas County Historical Society, and we want to wish Pinellas County tonight happy birthday on their 75th anniversary this year. Right now we want to look at some of our memorabilia from the post offices, and we want to thank the Pinellas County Historical Society and also the Palm Harbor Post Office for letting us have these on loan. This machine that we looked at to begin with is a cancellation machine from the 1950s. It's one of the many things that the post office has used in past years to help speed up the mail. Before this cancellation machine, each individual piece of mail had to be hand stamped. That wasn't too bad when there were only 5 families here in Palm Harbor, but it would certainly slow down things now. The next thing I want to show you is a picture of a train depot. It was the original train depot here in Palm Harbor. It has a little bit different architecture in that it's Russian. The person who designed it was a Russian architect, and it was designed in 1890. What the train did for us is speed up the mail by bringing it directly into Palm Harbor. Before that, or prior to 1890, we had to go to Clearwater from where the mail came from Cedar Key by boat. So this really helped us. Another thing that the Postal Service couldn't do without is your simple postage stamp. The one that I have here was mailed to Mrs. Flora Craver from Tallahassee, Florida in 1912. And the reason that this is significant is that that's our happy birthday, Pinellas County. And today, with our dapper pioneer editor Charlie Jones and our special guest Milton E. Nellinger, who is the postmaster of Dunedin, and Ernestine Nellinger, who is our postmaster here in Palm Harbor, we're going to trace very important parts of Pinellas County's history, and especially here in Palm Harbor. And now we want to turn it over to our pioneer editor Charlie Jones.
Thank you, BJ, and hello everyone in TV land. We're glad to bring you History in the News. We have a very interesting subject, the history of the Postal Service in Palm Harbor, Florida. The first Postmaster General of the United States received his commission in 1775 and was Benjamin Franklin. 103 years later, Palm Harbor received its first commission under the name of Bay St. Joseph's, and after St. Joseph's Sound. And the date was December 4th, 1878, and the first postmaster was J.C. Craver, a college graduate from Jonesboro, Illinois. He moved to Florida under orders from his doctor when he learned at the age of 27 that he had contracted tuberculosis, which was a very bad thing to have in those days. Tuberculosis was a killer because it didn't have treatments for it and didn't have the things that we have today to treat this bad disease. So he moved to the lush lands of Palm Harbor, Florida, and started improving his health. The location of his first post office in Mr. Craver's own home at crossroads of County Road 1 and Tampa Road 584. In 1888, Craver applied for and received another commission under the name of Sutherland, Florida. By this time, Craver had built a general store and post office in the downtown area on Florida Avenue. This building is now the Masonic Lodge, and this building is in good shape today and is used by the Masons throughout the county, and we are proud of this Masonic Lodge. This general store became the center of the community and continued in the role through the years. By the early 1920s, the post office had moved the northwest corner of Florida Avenue and Omaha Circle into a 2-story wooden building occupied by the town's doctor, Dr. Logan, which he had the pleasure of delivering many of the Palm Harbor babies at that time. Of course, it was called Southern at that time. The postmaster during this time was Mr. Durrance. In 1925, petition was passed around town to change the name to something more catchy. So Palm Harbor was decided upon with some resistance. And by the way, this Palm Harbor, the name Palm Harbor came from the abundance of palm trees around the marshes and on the main streets and so forth in Palm Harbor. And we're still proud of this name because we still have many cabbage palm trees around this area. By 1926, the post office moved down the street to Adair's Grocery, and the new post office master was Mr. Chamberlain. We are unsure of the reason for so many moves. Memories don't recall where the postmasters decided upon the locations or where the post office just outgrew the facility, but by 1929, there was another move to the other side of Florida Avenue in the old Troutman building, which is now occupied by a uniform shop. Mr. Troutman was the postmaster, and he was a man of great integrity, and he was ruler over many, many scouts. In fact, I was a scout under Mr. Troutman, and my son later, by the inspiration of Mr. Troutman, he later became a Negro Scout, which we are very proud of. A man most known for his many years of work for the Boy Scouts. Mr. Troutman was postmaster until 1953, when Mr. Roy Ely took over as officer in charge until August the 4th, 1954, when Milton E. Nellinger was appointed postmaster on August the 5th, 1954. He was given the difficult task of finding yet another home for the Palm Harbor Post Office. But he did, and he did it well. And we will find out how the rest of this history unfolds by the two people who were there. And now back to truly the queen of the dolls and the pride of Pinellas County, B.J. Maloney.
Thanks, Charlie. You're good looking too. This chronological history of the post office expresses many things. Changing in a community's growth, interest, transportation, because the post offices at this time were very, very important places. They were probably the main gathering places for people. They came in to pick up their mail. But not only that, they came in to pick up their dry goods, their staples, maybe get their hair cut, go get a soda. It was a nice, warm gathering place. It was a place also to exchange greetings, find out how people were. And the postmasters of this time were the overseers of this special gathering place. Not only did they make sure that the mail was delivered in the rain and the cold, not the snow, because we didn't have much of that, but he was almost like a member of the family, for he was usually there when news was received, whether it was good or bad. We are very fortunate tonight to have two such caring people. Their husband and wife, both postmasters, one of Palm Harbor, Ernestine Nellinger, and Milton Nellinger, who was also postmaster, as we learned, in Palm Harbor in the early 50s, who is now postmaster at Dunedin. Welcome. We're so glad to have you here tonight. I bet, did you learn a little bit about the post office history from listening to Charlie, or did you know all that?
No, we learned quite a bit.
It's really interesting to see how the post office changed locations, because that's kind of where the center of town relocated. We learned, Milton, we'll start with you first, that when you became postmaster in 1954, you had the difficult task of moving the post office again. Now, we've moved all over town. Was there a reason that it was especially hard at this point?
Well, BJ, in 1954, financing was almost, you just couldn't get any bank financing. So, in all of the buildings in Palm Harbor, which there wasn't many, but they were all full, and there wasn't any for rent. So we contacted a local resident, Mr. Tom Knoxstein, and he loaned me the money to build a building. As far as the moving around, before I came in, the postmasters moved whenever there was an election. The Democrats went in, a Democrat was put in as postmaster, and when Republicans went in, they changed, so that's one of the reasons that the post office changed buildings so many times.
And every time a postmaster came in, he could elect whether he wanted to move or not?
Usually, yes, because he had to furnish the building itself. He had to furnish some type of space for the post office.
So in 1955, you built a post office.
Yes, we built that on College Hill. We needed additional space as well as moving, and we moved in early 1955.
So you moved from a space that was how large?
Approximately 500 feet to one that was 1,000 square feet, which was sufficient at that time.
And you were servicing approximately how many boxes, postal boxes?
600 rural route and approximately 200 P.O. boxes.
Which would give us a population of what?
Approximately 1,800 people.
And that was 1955, 1,800 people.
Yes.
Now, could you give us an idea of the route that a piece of mail would take coming into Palm Harbor at this time? Where would you get your mail from?
From the, Claude Cater was the person who picked it up at the depot. And he would bring it in. We had 4 trains and a truck that came by each day. So we did have plenty of transportation coming in and also going out. Well, a letter would come in, we would give it to the rural carrier or put it up in P.O. boxes. At that time, that's all we had. Wallace Sutton was the rural carrier, and at that time, incidentally, he also delivered the rural route in Tarpon Springs. They didn't have a rural route out of there, so he went up and cased Tarpon Springs mail and then delivered it too.
Yeah, he received a special pin. Can you tell me a little? Now, did you give that to him, Ernestine?
Yes, Ernestine gave that to him.
What did that commemorate?
That commemorated the 1,000,000 miles that he had traveled delivering mail.
And how many years of a span was that?
In the time that he had been a mail carrier.
So approximately 20 years?
Oh yes, longer than that.
That's incredible. Okay, why don't we go back? We found out how the mail gets to us. Now, when I mailed something in the Palm Harbor Post Office, what happened to it?
Well, first we hand stamped it. Took a hand and bopped each one of them just like that. And then, of course, we sorted it to cities or states, and then we put it in a sack, in a mail sack. And there's 2 trains that stopped and 2 trains that didn't. The trains that stopped, of course, we just took it down to the depot.
And you had packages and
exactly.
everything else that went on,
We had quite a few
fruit.
packages, yes, and fruit, a lot of fruit at that time.
Well, that was one of Palm Harbor's major exports at that time, was the fruit.
Yes, yes. It wasn't necessarily going through the post office, but it was leaving from the depot.
From the train.
Right.
Okay, and then after you bundled it up, then what happened to it? You had 2 trains that stopped. Now, what about the trains that didn't stop?
Well, we had a catcher pouch. That was a sort of a thin sack, about so big, and it had a belt around the middle. We put some mail in the top and some in the bottom.
Now, it was kind of catchy how you balanced
right,
this.
yes,
If you didn't get it quite right, what would happen?
Well, the arm of the train would hit it, and it would go down and under the train sometimes, where it would be run over. But
that's when Scotch tape came in handy.
That's Scotch tape came in handy. But it had to be sort of equal in weight, so the catcher arm would pass by and catch the bag and continue on.
So how many pieces of mail do you think that you might have handled in one day's time, hand stamping it and hand sorting it and bundling it up and getting it to the train on time?
From 2,000 to 3,000.
That sounds like an awful lot. How many employees did you have at that time approximately?
Well, I had 2 besides
employees?
myself. It was Mrs. Troutman and Mrs. Kenton.
You must have had a lot of overtime.
Well, no, the postmaster didn't have that many hours, so the postmaster had to do the work.
Oh my goodness.
The postmaster duties at that time, I had to also work the window, so that was the difference.
Besides, okay, did you sort mail?
Oh yes, yes.
So
sorted mail.
you really did everything.
Oh yes, postmasters at that time had to do everything.
You worked
and that's
7
small
days
an
a week.
office.
7 days a week.
And that's small an office, we did, yes.
Now, how does that differ from your duties today as postmaster for Dunedin?
Well, of course, I don't work the window any longer. And I have a lot more employees. And also, I don't have rural routes in Dunedin. Ernestine has the rural routes in Palm Harbor.
Okay, up into 1955, all we had was rural routes. At what point did we change over and pick up the city delivery?
Well, we decided that we needed city delivery, but we had difficulty in finding population of 2,500 people. That was one of the criteria for establishing city routes, is for a population of 2,500. So the postal inspector, in fact his name was Shelton, came over and we tried to find 2,500. We had to go all the way north on alternate 19 to Baywood Village and get that area. Then we had to go out to Lakeshore Estates on Highway 19 to get our 2,500, but we did establish a city route at that time.
You even delivered into Dunedin at that point too, didn't you?
Yes, at that time we delivered right next door to the present high school in Dunedin, and then we went over to Main Street, which is 580, and we delivered out almost to Highway 19, and then we delivered on County Road 70.
And Wallace Sutton was still your rural carrier?
Yes, he was. We delivered both sides of the road on Main Street, so Dunedin wasn't delivering too much mail.
Well, in 1962, you got in first-class mail also, and that changed some things, didn't it? Exactly what did that change, Ernestine?
That meant that the post office became a first class. We had been a third class office when Milton became postmaster. Then the office went to a second class. And then when we went to first class, we got our famous canceling machine. We no longer had to hand cancel.
Now, what kind of social changes came in at that point when you were delivering the mail to people instead of having them come in and get it?
Well, the beautiful thing about not having city delivery was that we were the central gathering point for the people on a daily basis. And that seemed to be the highlight of a lot of the people in Palm Harbor of their day. And you got caught up on all of the news as to who had a baby or who was coming to visit or who was away in service, and all of the good news and the bad news. And it was a delightful time. Actually, when city delivery came into being in Palm Harbor, it rather hurt the businesses in the area there where the people gathered every day.
Because they had to come to town to pick up their mail and thus use the services there.
That's right.
Well, I sure appreciate it. We're going to break for a history moment right now, but we'll be right back and find out what kind of changes took place in the 1970s. Thank you.
This is Bill Sears at Heritage Park, standing in front of the oldest existing log house in Pinellas County. In 1848, with a 240-acre government land grant in his possession, Captain James Paramore McMullen, his wife, and several slaves began a new life in the wilderness of the west coast of Florida. Using heart of pine logs, they put together this Georgia-style log house, which contains 4 rooms, 2 downstairs with a dog trot between them, and 2 upstairs. 8 of the McMullen children were born in this house, as well as 50 others, with Mrs. McMullen acting as midwife. Clearing land at the rate of 1 acre in 1 year, Captain McMullen established pasture and cropland that provided subsistence for the large family. This house, as it was when the McMullen family occupied it, may be seen today at Heritage Park.
Welcome back. I know you enjoyed that look at Heritage Park. We're in the 70s now with the post office in Palm Harbor. We've moved, in 1960, we moved from the center of the duplex and we added on another space that was larger than before. We air conditioned the post office, which is the first time Palm Harbor had air conditioning. We automated it to a point with an automated canceling machine. So we've speeded things up quite a bit, but we've made it a little bit impersonal in some ways with our city delivery. But there's some other far-reaching effects that took place in the 1970s. The first being that there was a whole new reorganization that came about. Ernestine, could you tell us a little bit about that? It was around, what, 1971?
1971. The old post office department became the U.S. Postal Service in 1971. The appointments of postmasters was changed. There were postal employees became unionized. There were a lot of changes that took place in that postal reorganization.
Okay, one of the major changes for Palm Harbor is Milton left us for Dunedin, but we got Ernestine as officer in charge, and that was 1971. And then in 1973, you became postmaster.
Yes, I served as officer in charge or acting postmaster at that time.
Now, what was the difference between being officer in charge and postmaster?
It was just a difference in title. Now they're called officer in charge. At that time, we were called acting postmasters. I was the assistant to the postmaster prior to his leaving, and they didn't fill that position for almost 2 years. He left in October of '71 to go to Dunedin, and they didn't fill the postmaster vacancy until August of '73.
Now, there should be some changes here between 1955 when you, or 1954 when you became postmaster, and 1973 when you became postmaster. What were our changes in population?
We began to grow here at that time.
I mean, did you really notice a surge? Not like now, but...
Not like now, but yes. For Palm Harbor, it was a surge. I remember we used to think of a business that brought in a tray of mail as being a tremendous business, and of course now that's just common everyday happening for many businesses.
Now, we went, what, from 600 boxes inside the post office to how many?
Well, now
In the 70s?
we have close to 1,200 boxes now, but we have so much delivery that we really don't need the post office boxes as much.
Now, in the late 60s, your boundaries changed a little bit. Milton, you dropped delivery to Dunedin.
In the immediate area of Dunedin, yes. Palm Harbor still delivers down County Road 1 to Michigan Boulevard, and also down County Road 70, and takes care of both sides of the road there until they come to Dunedin delivery. Incidentally, whenever I went to Dunedin, it was a promotion. Dunedin had more business, more revenue, more deliveries, more everything. So it was a promotion. But now Palm Harbor last year caught up with Dunedin in the deliveries, and they haven't looked back. They're still going ahead of us.
During the reorganization, Tampa helped you with something. They came in with, before that you were sorting all of the mail. At that point, what did that mean to you as far as workforce and time hours spent when Tampa took over your sorting?
What that meant was that we didn't need as many cases for outgoing distribution. We didn't need to increase our clerk staffing for outgoing distribution. It saved space. It kept us in the building a lot longer because we didn't have to add the additional equipment or the additional employees. That was done by machinery in Tampa at the MSC.
Did you like that?
We were reluctant to begin with. Nobody likes change, and everyone was afraid that their staffing would be cut. But as it worked out in our case, the growth became quite prevalent then, and we didn't lose anyone. We were ahead of the game all the time as far as employees were concerned.
So what point did you start bulging at the seams?
Prior to our move in '77, we had a trailer out back of the building there on Flott Avenue, and we were side by side until you couldn't get a mail cart through.
I bet Christmas was fun.
We lined up our parcels outside in the driveway, and there's where we dispatched our parcels in the evening.
That's incredible. In 1977, what happened?
We moved into our new facilities on Alternate 19 at 495 Alternate 19. We were extremely proud of our new building. The building itself was a beautiful thing and very well landscaped. And the design won a national award. It came in second on a national architectural award, for which we were very proud.
Well, your architect is the husband of one of the people who helped us with Pinellas Palace, Connie Modano, so we're real proud of that.
Yes.
And at this point, you're looking to increase your size again.
Right. We now have 2 trailers out back. We had a tent this Christmas to work our parcels in.
How many extra employees did you have to hire for Christmas this year?
In our particular office, we hired only 3 or 4, but for the annex that did the outgoing managed mail distribution, there were about 130 casuals that we hired here in Palm Harbor to work that outgoing mail.
How many pieces of mail do you handle on an average day?
Oh, probably 20,000. Depending on the day, of course, we can go from outgoing mail. It just depends upon the day of the month, and we don't count our outgoing mail now because we don't cancel it.
Mm-hmm.
But when we do count our mail coming in, we're looking at, first-class mail, possibly between 20 to 30,000 pieces.
There's something else that changed in the 70s that we ought to mention, and that's prior to a certain point, the postmaster had the responsibility in Palm Harbor of numbering all the houses. At what point did you relinquish that duty?
That was given to the county in the late 1970s. That was a welcome relief. We were beginning to grow quite rapidly, and it was a very big chore to have to number all the subdivisions as they came online.
And now the county takes care of that. But one thing, when we only had rural boxes, it was very difficult to find people. If, you know, there are many instances of someone died in the family, and you were telling me of an instance where somebody died in the family and they couldn't find the relatives. And many times they knocked on your door very late at night and said, where?
Well, yes, the police would have to come to us. Just route 1 box so-and-so that didn't give them any information. So yes, we had to either take them or go with them or explain to them just where it was. It was something that had to be done. Mm-hmm. And it's just one of the things the postmasters did in small offices all over the nation. All
over the country.
Yes.
They still do it.
They still do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank both of y'all for being with us tonight. You're 2 very special people. I've worked with Ernestine in many things, and you still carry forth that caring love that the postmasters did of old, and we appreciate that here in Palm Harbor. And we just want you to know that our support is behind you 100% in your new growth.
Thank you.
Thank you, BJ.
Thank you for being with us tonight. Bye. Welcome to Pinellas Past. My name is B.J. Maloney. Tonight we're going to take another look in the celebration of Pinellas County's 75th anniversary at another charming town here in Pinellas County. And the name of that town is Dunedin. It's a Gulfside town and it's one of the second oldest cities in the state of Florida. But first of all, we have a tape on Dunedin from people who have been there, who reminisce about the things that they remember as children and the things that they were told by some of their ancestors. Those people are Vivian Skinner Grant, Elbert Watterson, Ben Skinner, Lee Dodge, and also Mr. Gus Cooper. Mr. Gus Cooper will be with us tonight in an interview and tell us a little bit about the things that are going on Dunedin today. But first of all, what I want you to do is sit back and relax. Make sure you have a bowl of popcorn by your side, and we're going to take a stroll through Dunedin's past.
With the current population of Dunedin ever growing and new businesses springing up, it is hard to think of Dunedin as it was over 75 years ago. This documentary will take you on a trip through the history of Dunedin and some of its earliest roots. We'll take you back over 100 years to 130 years ago when the first land parcel in Dunedin was given to Richard L. Garrison in 1852. And we'll take you to the future of Dunedin as it continues to grow and as Florida becomes one of the most populated states in the nation. The earliest roots of Dunedin start in 1852 when land was given to Dunedin's first settler, Richard L. Garrison. By 1876, there were only 12 land settlers as the United States celebrated her 100th birthday. Dunedin at the time was a trading post for its surrounding neighbors and has claim in being the oldest village on the west coast of Florida between Cedar Key and Key West. There is much history and lore about this town, which was originally a trading post in its earliest days, and later a recreational resort area featuring such places as Honeymoon and Caladesi Islands, beaches, clubs, and of course sailing. But industry was soon to follow with the advent of the railway and the growth of the citrus manufacturing equipment and processing. At one time, Dunedin could boast proudly of having the world's largest citrus manufacturing plant and would soon stake claim in the creation of citrus concentrate that would help the market have more control over providing the nation with orange juice, even during the freeze years. The amphibious alligator was created here by Mr. Roebling and was instrumental in French beach assaults and landings during World War II. From the earliest settlers to the current residents, Dunedin has attracted many to its beautiful surroundings and its land of opportunity. Even today, the Dunedin of old can be seen at the Historical Society's museum on Main Street. Stories of old flourish as told by the descendants of the earliest settlers and most dynamic individuals of Dunedin's past.
My name is Vivian Skinner Grant. My grandfather, Lee Brunson Skinner, came here in 1883 from Watertown, Wisconsin. He was a young man of 22, and he was going to plant orange trees and manage the grove for the Milwaukee Grove Company, an investment company out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And at that time, he homesteaded land approximately at the rear end of the Hood plant under some big oak trees. Grandpa and Grandma went to the church out in the cemetery at first, and then he and a few other men decided that they ought to build a church downtown at the corner of Scotland and Highland. So this was accomplished in 1888. And that's the church, Andrews Memorial Chapel, that we moved in 1970 because it was no longer functional, and the church fathers decided they would have to tear it down. So a group of us sprang into action and raised the money and found somebody over in Tampa, a nice old Florida cracker, who agreed to move it, and another man who had to cut the church in half. And it was moved one half at a time along Highland Avenue up through La Paloma and around San Jose Circle and over to San Mateo and down to the end of San Mateo and into the park, one half at a time. And it took 5 days to move the two halves. And the power and light companies had to take down all the wires and put them back up again. And that church is so tall, it's 50 feet tall, and it was wobbling up among the pine trees as it was going through these narrow streets, and I was afraid it was going to fall over and land on somebody's house. I was scared to death. But the wind did not blow for 5 days. It was a miracle. Grandpa and Grandma first lived on their homestead, then they moved to Victoria Drive and built a house there in 1890. There were several very big houses built along there in 1890, 1889, 90, 91, 92. Grandpa's house burned down in 1926, but there are still 3 very big, very old houses up there. The one at 1037, owned by Margaret Burnside, and the Chase house, the big yellow house, and the Boughton McDougall house, the big gray house. And they're still there. And of course, a big deal in those days was sailing. You should have seen the Dunedin dock. It was a tiny little dock about 4 feet wide that went out into the water, and anchored to it were these huge sailboats about 35 feet long. Everybody had sailboat races on Sunday, and they used to go over to the island and have a picnic. They had a little shelter over there. Of course, there was no causeway there. The Clearwater Causeway was built in 26. So they would sail over and have a picnic and sail back. And Dunedin in the early days was the social and economic center. They had there was a big old wooden hotel at the corner of Broadway and Monroe Street where the Quick Nick's is now, and this was called the Yacht Club Inn. And they had waltzes there every Saturday night, and people came from as far away as Onona and Bayview and the southern part of the peninsula. Grandpa had the first car in Pinellas County in 1907. It was a Rio. And of course, after the cars were invented, they had to pave the streets. Although I know some of the early streets that were deeply rutted, you'd bounce up and down like this on them, and Grandma's hat went down over her nose because she hit the ceiling. And another time, of course, the seats were very high on these old cars. They were going around a curve, and Grandma just slid off and sat on the bank. This was on the way to Tampa, and Grandpa didn't miss her for about a mile. He had to come back. In 1926 or thereabouts, Dr. Meese, I think it was 27, used the Blue Moon Inn down at the corner of Edgewater and Main where the Sunblessed Apartments is, and he turned that Blue Moon Inn into a 10-bed sanatorium. And he stayed there until about 1934. Dunedin had 3 very, very big hotels that we were very proud of in the early days. One was the Dunedin Hotel, also called the Dunedin Lodge, which was on where the Edgewater Arms is now. And that was built to face the road, Edgewater Drive, because the people wanted to sit up on the porch and see who was going by. The kitchen faced the water and the sunsets. In the early days, they didn't realize the value of the water, so they had the hotel facing the road. And then the Yacht Club Inn was built a whole block from the water. They were kind of afraid of storms and hurricanes. And so that was at the corner of Monroe and Broadway. In the beginning, Dunedin just went from Lee Street to President Street. And it just went from Victoria Drive, Broadway, and Douglas Avenue. That's all it was. Then it went a little farther to Highland Avenue. And Main Street just ended, it came to a dead end on Douglas. But some of the businessmen in Dunedin decided that Main Street should not come to a dead end at Douglas. So they had Mr. M.W. Moore, Gavin Douglas's father-in-law, Margaret Moore's father, raise the money quietly and buy up the right-of-way to cut Main Street through. So he did it. When they had all the right-of-way bought, they put Main Street through on a diagonal running from Douglas to Bass Boulevard. And then it picked up where it does now and went on out and joined Pinehurst, which was County Road 1.
At a time when Dunedin's population was just starting to grow and tourists discovered the recreational facilities in this small town, B.C. Skinner was already well underway on manufacturing the equipment that would be used in citrus processing. The earliest and most profitable industry in Dunedin had started and would eventually bring over $9 million a year to the city.
From the middle 1800s, when the first settlers came down here, the The gold mine was to plant oranges and ship fresh fruit to northern markets. And these packing houses that developed from that became highly mechanized from the original hand operation of individually scrubbing and wrapping each orange in tissue paper to the point where they're automatically sized, polished, waxed, preserved, and automatically packed. Manufacturing in Dunedin might be said to have started in almost 100 years ago, in 1893, when my grandfather started the L.B. Skinner Manufacturing Company. This business continued manufacturing packing house equipment for the citrus industry until 1917, after my father graduated from college and took it over, renamed it the B.C. Skinner Machinery Company. That company continued manufacturing for all phases of the citrus industry, including the canning plants and the fresh fruit packing houses, until about 1932, at which time it was sold to Food Machinery Corporation, who later moved to Lakeland in the mid-40s. That time my father got interested in the concentrated orange juice business and started what was known as citrus concentrates in 1932. In 1942, it was expanded with a federal loan to provide orange concentrate for veterans hospitals and for shipment overseas to England. In the 1940s, when it was running full blast, they were processing about 40,000 pounds, a semi-trailer load of oranges every 30 minutes. This amounted to approximately $9 million of oranges a year, and it was a real a juggling match between the banks, the bonded warehouses, the financiers, the growers, and the pickers to keep it all in operation. The biggest event in the history of this plant occurred in August of 1945, when a fire was started over here in the northwest corner of a storage area which contained a lot of concentrated orange juice, cardboard carton storage, and with the facilities available and even with the sprinkler system, they were unable to contain it. You may have seen pictures elsewhere, and it was some horrible sight. 400 feet by 400 feet of smoldering, bent, twisted steel and crumbled rocks. My father wasn't one to be discouraged, and forced through a very fair insurance settlement and set about rebuilding. In the mid-30s, the canning industry developed efficiencies to the point that they could afford to can the orange juice. This started the slow downhill trend in the packing industry, but lasted only for about 10 or 15 years until frozen concentrate came out and completely took over the market.
Milbert Watterson, former editor of the Dunedin Times and past president of the Dunedin Historical Society, talks about Dunedin's past and the fond memories he holds for this town.
I'm Milbert Watterson. I've had the honor of being the first president of the Dunedin Historical Society. I've been a resident of Dunedin for 50 years, and I was former editor and publisher of the Dunedin Times for 20 years. At the very beginning, I'd like to say that Dunedin is the second oldest city on the west coast of Florida. Cedar Key was the oldest, and Dunedin was established. Our first resident came here in, I believe, 1852, and was awarded a piece of property on Curlew Creek in the northwest corner of what is now Spanish Trail subdivision. Dunedin served as a port of mail and supplies and everything from Cedar Key to this area, and we were granted our charter in 1900. Then in 1878, the post office was officially granted the title by the United States government. And that makes us the second oldest on this coast and the first oldest in Pinellas County. St. Petersburg followed along soon after us. During the time that the society has been in operation, we have had quite a number of old buildings in Dunedin put on the National Register. One being the Douglas building on the corner of Scotland Street and Edgewater Drive. And of course the railroad station, which is now serving as the museum for the Historical Society. The Ralph Blatchley's father's house out on the corner of Lee Street and Broadway was put on the historic record, and then it was purchased, still basically the same as the senior Mr. Blatchley, which was a nature writer. He spent most of his time and did most of his writing here in Dunedin at that home, and he called it his nature nook. The museum was at that time at the railroad station. The railroad here was the Atlantic Coastline, and through the officials of the coastline, after the railroad was discontinued service here, we were given a temporary lease on it at $1 a year, I believe. We paid the railroad station, railroad to let us use the museum, the station as a museum. We did move all of our artifacts in there, and when I sold my newspaper, I came across a box full of the old pictures that I've given to the Historical Society. They are in the museum along with considerable artifacts and papers that are quite valuable.
In your 50 years here, how have you seen the Main Street change, basically?
It's not anything like the same Main Street now. When I first came to Dunedin, it ended where the fire station is on the corner of Highland Avenue, and I mean, it was the fire station, now it's the ambulance based there. That was the end of town. It was woods from there on and a narrow brick road on out. And there was one building was built where the Dunedin Times is now. That was one of the first buildings built outside of that area before anything developed in that area there. But that was about the end of town then, and I often say that in those days I went down the street, I saw somebody I knew, I turned around to speak to them. Now if I find somebody I know, I stop them to find out who they are or what's happening. There's been so much change. The population then was between 850 and 1,000 when I first came to Dunedin in 1929.
With the boom in home building and growth in full swing, Dunedin still chooses to preserve its fruitful past by refurbishing its museum so its artifacts will be preserved and memories not forgotten. The new Historical Society president and city administrator of Dunedin knows the necessity of creating a new and accessible museum for the citizens and visitors of this beautiful town.
I'm Lee Dodge, current president of the Dunedin Historical Society. I'm also Director of Administration for the City of Dunedin, and I'm a relative newcomer to the city. Been here now going on my 4th year, and have been associated with the Historical Society for the past 2 years. And I think at the present time, after listening to our first president, Albert Watterson, we are going through the second revival of the Dunedin Historical Society. In November of this year, well, November of '86, the DOT purchased the railroad from CSX Railway, the parent company of Seaboard Coastline, and they have indicated that they would be very pleased to lease the railroad station to the city of Dunedin, who will lease it, sublease it to the Historical Society. And a couple of weeks ago, the City Commission approved a motion to permit the city manager to negotiate a lease on the railroad station with the intent of subleasing it to the Dunedin Historical Society. The condition of the station is in pretty bad shape. The railroad, of course, dates back to 1888. Next year it will have its 100th anniversary. The current station dates back to the period of the early 20s. And for the past several years, since the station has been dormant as a train station, why no major renovation has taken place. And the roof has deteriorated. It leaks like a sieve. The floor is wooden. It's in relatively bad condition. And the building does need major renovation. And so what we are looking forward to is getting a long-term lease through the city and the Department of Transportation. And then we intend to put a new roof on the main station. We have asked an architect who has agreed to work with us at no cost to provide the plans for renovation. And this probably will mean tearing down the freight warehouse, which is attached to the back of it, because it is in real serious dilapidated condition and presents a fire hazard, which the city fire marshal is not very pleased with. And hopefully we will be able to add some additional space onto the train station to enhance the area where we display our artifacts and documents. And I think our first task is to get the railroad station in first-class shape and provide what we hope to be one of the best museums on the west coast of Florida. Then, of course, we can participate in some of the other buildings. There's an octagonal house on Scotland Street, which is presently owned by Dr. Winchester. And that has a lot of history behind it. Because we are the second oldest behind Cedar Key, why there's just a lot of old homes and things in Dunedin that could be renovated and would qualify for being placed on the National Register. Now, and of course, you know, Dunedin has a lot of history that is significant. As you know, during World War II, the development of the Alligator, the armored vehicle used by the U.S. Marines to attack the Japanese islands in the Pacific, was developed by Roebling. He was one of the founders of the steel company, the Roebling Steel Company, and he lived in Clearwater, and he invented the Alligator. And I believe that the Marine base, which is located at the site of the now Harborview Villa development, which is right at the foot of the hill in front of the Dunedin Golf Course. That was the site of the Marine base, and that was where they trained and used these amphibious landing craft, dubbed the Alligator. And there's a plaque has been located there to commemorate that. Now, it is in our charter that the Dunedin Historical Society is responsible for this procedure of placing these structures on the National Historic Register. And we, of course, will do that as time permits. But right now, we are busy getting our own museum squared away so that we can have what we hope to be the best museum on the West Coast.
I want to thank you tonight for being with us. Mr. Cooper is Vice President of the Dunedin Historical Society. Mr. Dodge has really laid out an energetic schedule for the Historical Society this year. Not only are you doing the preservation and restoration of the old depot, but you have several other things coming along.
Well,
one of them you have right here in your lap.
Well, let me say thank you for having us on this program. Mr. Dodge and Vivian Grant and the rest of us who are active are very fortunate that our predecessors did such a good job. And the project I have in my hands here is a book called Through the Years that was published about 10 years ago, and it covers Dunedin's history from 1850 to 1978. And we are going to update it and publish it again since it is out of print. And that will take a lot of time. There is rich material here. Just the name of the city of Dunedin, which was named after Edinburgh in Scotland. And the translation is Dun means rock and Eden means castle. And therefore Dunedin is castle on the rock.
It's beautiful.
So that is one of the things in this book. Another thing that's in here, you referred to the chapel, which was moved.
The half a chapel.
The half a chapel, half and half, was moved to its present site in what is called the hammock. And the hammock is really a park, but it is a preservation of an area of natural environment of the state of Florida.
Now, it's one of how many in Florida?
It was the first, and it is one of 13 state natural features.
And when was this started?
This was, 12, 15 years ago. The Garden Club, they now have a hammock advisory committee, of which Vivian Grant is a member. Actually, she's the president of that.
Busy lady.
She is a busy lady. But we have a rich heritage in Dunedin, and those of us who are relative newcomers are extremely fortunate to have had the work that has been done by people like Vivian Grant and Dottie and Claire Miller, who ran the museum. And of course, we are grateful to the members of our coffee clutch who meet every morning at 9:30, and the profits from their coffee urn go to pay our $1-a-year rent.
Your $1-a-year rent.
That's what we paid to the railroad. So now we're going to branch out a little bit. The restoration of the depot is a 4-phase program that probably will take 5 to 10 years and probably costs up to $250,000. So we have our work cut out for us.
And what 4 phases are those?
Well, first we're going to repair the roof, and then we're going to tear down the freight warehouse, which the fire department says has to go. Then we'll take the white paint off the red brick, and finally we will restore the freight warehouse. And we hope that the restoration of the Depot Museum will be the start of the revitalization of the entire Dunedin downtown. That's a mouthful.
That is a mouthful. Dunedin is a very beautiful community, and it's really heartwarming that people such as yourself and the others that have been on the show tonight have taken the interest and the time to preserve it. It takes a lot of caring and loving to do that.
Well, we hope that those who see this program may come and drive through some of the older sections of the city where we still have brick pavement.
And you're celebrating the Highland Games.
We have the Highland Games this coming week, and we will have our Scottish heritage in full bloom.
Oh, and we'll see a little bit of that in the tape following.
Dunedin might not become the commercial and social mecca that it once was in the late 1800s, but the Dunedin of today is still highly proud of its fruitful past. Even today, Dunedin residents celebrate their Scottish roots with a Highland game.